Hi everybody, Cheryl and Lady coming to you from the Ladies Garden and Home, and today we're going to talk about the next phase in seedling care, which is when to pot up, when to fertilize. So I hope you join us. Come on, Lady, want to go outside? Video, I told you about a trick that I had learned from Jenna over at Growfully with Jenna, and that is to put aluminum foil on the other side of your sunny window if you're not growing with grow lights. So I did that. I also brought in half of my mini greenhouse from outside that in the summer I was using as like a potting bench, and I put it on top of my tea cart. And I actually went from spacing for 6 flats to 10, which was nice. And up here, I have more space I can use. So let's take a look at how they're doing now and how the aluminum foil might be working. Up here is some alyssum that I sowed. That's already starting to sprout. We've got the nasturtium that have not popped up yet. So I have them in the plastic bag as a humidity dome. We have Archie, the artichoke, who is my single seed challenge. Here's some leafy greens, the lettuces and the spinach. Over here is some cabbage that I already potted up, and also some Swiss chard. And here's some herbs. We've got cilantro, dill, parsley, and fennel. Over here are some brassicas and the celery. And if you can tell, there's a little bit of stretching going on, but very, very little. So I think the aluminum foil is working very nicely. Down here we have peppers, the different types of peppers. And as you can see, they're growing up pretty much 2 by 2. And I do that on purpose with peppers because they don't mind growing together like that. And then you get double the peppers. Over here is a completely unseeded tray because I'm going to be using this soil to pot up some of those brassicas I just showed you. And here are the sweet peas. Now the sweet peas are taking a little bit longer than I thought. This one is bigger because that was the first type of variety that I had, and I started that earlier. And then, as you can see, they're just starting to show their little root hairs on top of the soil there. So they're just taking a little bit longer to germinate. And here are the onions and leeks. I've given them a haircut to help them stand up straight. So let's talk about troubleshooting first. So in my last video about seedlings, I ended it by saying that, you know, the gardening journey is all about failure and learning from those mistakes and failures. And you've got a choice when something fails, and that's either to start again or to change your plan. So in a couple of things, I have changed my plan, and in a couple of things, I did start again. So in this flat was closer to the floor, and one morning I realized my cat had either sat in it or walked across it, but here in the middle, everything that I had sowed was flattened and recoverable from. So what I did is I transplanted some that were still healthy, and I just reseeded. I reseeded the spinach, which is coming up here, and I reseeded the lettuce. So I decided to start again because lettuce is a very important part of my garden this year. Here's another plant that is, I'm really looking forward to having in my garden this year. This is a hibiscus, and I had seeded a couple of seeds and they were growing up nicely. One I already pulled because it damped off, and this one looks like now it's doing the same thing. It could be cold. I don't know. Maybe it's because it's too close to the window and it got too cold one night. But regardless, I am going to try to seed this again. These onions were a tangled mess. This is the second time I've had to trim them to help them stand up straight. And the other problem that I've been having is a lot of fungus was starting to grow on top. So in my last video on seedling care, I explained how you could either scrape off the fungus if you feel like it's getting in the way of the growth and the health of your plants. And I did that. And then I sprinkled a very heavy dose of cinnamon on top. So I'm hoping that that problem, if I keep on top of the cinnamon, I'm hoping that that problem does not redevelop. This entire row of Brussels sprouts also never germinated. And I sowed these on January 29th. So at this point, I've decided to just change the plan. I'm not going to re-sow them. I'm going to try them again in the fall. Since none of them germinated at all, I think the problem was that the seed was quite old. So I will start them again in the fall with fresh seeds. And I will, I guess, have more room this spring for something else in the garden. When do you know it's time to start fertilizing your seedlings? Well, at this phase, when they still only have their first seed leaves or cotyledons, they don't need to be fertilized. They're getting all of their nutrition from the seed leaves. But at this phase of the game, with pretty much everything on the flats, true leaves having come in, it's time to fertilize. Now, how do I do that? I do that when it's time to water, and I use this AgroThrive Organic General Purpose Liquid Fertilizer. It has a low percentage of fertilizer. It's a 3-3-2 mix. And I dilute it for the seedlings. They have instructions on the back. I put 2 ounces in with a gallon of water. Whether I'm watering or fertilizing, I always bottom water because it makes sure that the plant's roots are getting the fertilizer, and it also makes sure that you don't overwater or underwater, because sometimes if you were to water on top, maybe the water doesn't get all the way down to the bottom where it's needed. So what I do is I put about 2/3 of the way this mixture, and I let it sit for about 2 hours, or until all of the liquid has been absorbed. If it's all been absorbed, I usually put a little bit more in just to make sure it just didn't run out before everything was nice and soaked up. And then after the 2 hours, what I do is I save the fertilizer. I just pour it back in this gallon jar. And the way you know when a tray needs to be watered is the top will become rather light brown, And also the tray itself will appear much lighter than it does now, for example. It's very, very heavy because I had this soaking for 2 hours before I started filming this video. So now let's talk about potting up. When to pot them up, which ones to pot up, and also how you pot up. And this is something that I try to avoid doing as much as possible. Now, if you were to start something off in a much deeper pot, like this one here, compared to this one, which is a 60-cell tray, this is just a 6-cell tray, but you see how much deeper it is, then you may not have to pot up at all until you go out to the garden. But I don't have the room to start everybody off in a bigger pot like that. So these trays, by the way, the 60-cell tray is a little splurge that I did. It is from Charles Dowding. I don't remember the company that distributes the product in the United States, but it is an extremely durable tray. I have to say that. And the other thing that I like about it is, if you can see here on the bottom, the holes are very, very large, and you can stick your finger up there and just pop out the seedling. So when to pot up? Well, the first thing is you want to wait, or at least I do. Some people do transplant much younger. I find that it is a very difficult thing to do if you're not particularly gentle enough. And I've lost too many seedlings that way. So I do wait until they at least have their true leaves. You really don't want to wait this long, because what we're going to run into here is probably a pretty established root system that you really don't want to damage. And this is actually probably the most ideal size to pot them up, this celery here, because not only do they have their true leaves, but their roots are probably not very deep yet, so you don't really run too much of a risk of damaging them and causing transplant shock. Going back to troubleshooting for just a minute, there's a problem that many, many gardeners have when they are starting their seeds, and that is when they get leggy. For example, when they stretch to the light and they become very thin and spindly, or like in this instance, they're competing with each other for space, and they've gotten a little bit leggy, I think, because of that. So there's a trick that you can do, and it doesn't work with all plants, but I have found personally that it does work with brassicas, and it definitely works with tomatoes, and that is you can bury them in their new container a little bit more deeply to kind of get them some strength and support. So I'm going to show you how I do that with these broccoli. So what tools do you need when you are potting up? Well, you can use these types of tools. This is a fork and a little tiny shovel, a dibber that you could make the hole with. You don't need these though. You can use a marker as a dibber. You could use the end of, I don't know, a kitchen implement for the dibber if you're trying to make a little bit larger holes. You could use a tiny little teaspoon measurer thing, or a tiny little fork to scoop them out. And then, of course, you want your markers to mark them. Now, I happen to have a ton of popsicle sticks left over from something, but normally what I do is I just cut up yogurt cups and you know, sour cream cups and that kind of stuff, and I use that in the garden. Honestly, these popsicle sticks, they get a little bit fungusy, and they start breaking down. That might be a good thing for out in the garden. I'm not so sure it's a good thing for inside the house when I have such bad fungus issues. And I have that because I live in a very damp climate. I'm just about, I think, 750 feet from the beach, and at night when the lights are on in the parking lot and the streets, you can literally see even if it's not raining, waves of fog, just waves of fog against the light. So we have a very humid climate here. By the way, I have cardboard on top of my table, as well as newspaper for easy cleanup. Also, at this point, you're going to want to thin what are not the healthiest plants. So if you can see, this one, it looks like its neck is a little rotted. It's very weak. We're going to just remove it that way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this dough mixer to make a rather large, deep hole. If it was tiny, tiny seedlings, I would probably use, you know, something like more like that, or a narrow pencil. Okay. And I'm going to see if I can pop it up through the top. Oh, yep, I did. That's great. And well, that popped out very nicely. Nicely done, Charles Dowding. And I'm going to very, very gently, without hopefully tearing any roots, or at least minimally, see, we have very long roots here. And then I'm going to just drop it in, kind of leading the roots with my finger. And I'm going to bury it pretty deep. I'm going to bury it without burying any of the leaves. And that should give it some nice support. I got 2 more here. This one looks like it's at a little smaller stage of development. What we want to do is make sure that we're holding it by their leaves when we do this. And unfortunately, if we break somebody's neck, that's it. All right, so what I'm working on right now are the Waltham broccoli. That is the variety of broccoli. Okay, here's just one. A little hard for me to get my finger in there. Okay, I got it. So with it's just transplanting one, I just want to make sure that the hole is wide enough and deep enough to kind of match that size. There we go. That popped in very nicely. Let's get that down deep. And at this point, you really want to make sure that the soil is very firm. And it's not only to strengthen and support the seedling, but it's also when you go to plant out in the garden, if you have loose, airy soil, what's going to happen is it's going to like break apart. But if you have nice, firm soil and you pull it out to put it in the ground, then it retains that nice soil around the roots. It doesn't disturb the roots so much, and you won't get that transplant shock that happens to so many plants when you plant them. And I was very cautious about this last year too, and I noticed I had very, very little transplant shock on any of my plants. So let's hopefully keep that trend going. And transplant shock doesn't mean that the plant's going to die. All it means is that it's going to take a while to recover. And it's going to have a lot to recover from anyway. Elements, new soil, different watering kind of requirements. It's not going to be babied as much. So you want to reduce the chance of transplant shock as much as you can. Just to, oh, look at that. I keep getting my finger caught. Okay. Just gently, gently, gently tease them apart. There we go. So I'm going to try for 12. So I'm going to go ahead and finish potting up my Waltham broccoli, and I'll be back when I'm done. Okay, well that didn't take too long. So I have 12 cells of the Waltham broccoli, 6 cells of the DeChico broccoli, and 6 cells of the cauliflower. A little bit more broccoli than I had initially planned, but you know, at this point they're still very young, so we have to kind of make room in case something happens to them. As for the celery, since this tray is pretty much empty, I'm going to be reusing some of the soil that's left, and I'm going to be transplanting probably about 24 celery. I found celery is not particularly easy to grow, and although I'm really only targeting 6 plants, I want to have a little bit of a, like more than a little bit of a buffer to make sure that I get those 6 plants. I know that this is a little bit unusual looking. You might not like this look in your kitchen, but I'm telling you, if you can avoid having to pay for electricity, especially today, and you've got yourself a nice south-facing window, this really, I think, solar power has worked very nicely this year for me, with a lot less tragedies. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like. I hope if you are on your seedling journey, things are going well for you. But if they're not, remember, failure is kind of part of the gardening journey. It's what we make out of it. It's the decisions that we make afterwards, and it's the learning that we do. I also wanted to thank my subscribers because this week I went past 250. Thank you very much, and I hope that I continue to inspire you as kind of a lone gardener in my late 50s. If I can do it, you can do it. So I appreciate the fact that we're growing such a really, really nice community where we're, you know, chatting and giving each other tips and that kind of thing, and I'd love to see that grow even further. So if you haven't subscribed yet, I hope you do. Thank you, everybody.